È con emozione oggi che vi chiedo di dare il benvenuto al nostro prossimo ospite, Ted Chiang, che è, a ragione, ritenuto uno degli autori di science fiction, uno degli autori di narrativa fantastica più influenti del pianeta. Tra le tante cose, un suo racconto contenuto in questa raccolta è stato trasformato in un film da Denis Villeneuve intitolato Arrival con Amy Adams di qualche anno fa, e oggi Ted Chiang ci parlerà di due modi di pensare al fantastico. Il tema sarà la narrativa speculativa. La lezione è in inglese, ci saranno delle slide. Io so che voi parlate un ottimo inglese, siete in grado di seguirlo, ne sono sicuro, ma nel caso vi chiedo di nuovo cercare di mantenere il passo con lui. Se dovessimo finire in un punto del ragionamento particolarmente complesso, alzate la mano, e per fortuna abbiamo qui con noi il direttore artistico del Festival Letterario Libri in Nizza, Fulvio Gatti, che ringrazio anche per averci aiutato a portare Ted Chiang in Italia, e ci verrà in soccorso, ok? Però per adesso un grande applauso a Ted Chiang.
Hello. Thank you for having me. So yes, I only speak English, so I'm afraid I have to deliver this talk in English. I will try and go slowly. And yes, if you are having trouble understanding what I'm saying, hopefully, yeah, you can just raise your hand, and then I will point to someone who will hopefully facilitate. So I'm a science fiction writer, and I'm going to talk about science fiction and fantasy writing. And even though I imagine most of you are not science fiction or fantasy writers, I do think that speculative fiction and the fantastic are becoming more popular. They're finding their way into a lot of different forms of writing, and so hopefully this will be of some interest to you, even if you are not a science fiction or fantasy writer. So I want to talk about the fantastic from the standpoint of two artistic movements of the past. And the first of these artistic movements is naturalism. Naturalism was an approach that was pioneered by the writer Émile Zola, and I should say that what he meant by naturalism is not going to be exactly the same thing as what I am talking about when I say naturalism, but I think you will understand why I'm using this phrase in a minute. So I want to. I'm using the word naturalism as in a different sense than realism, because realism, if we say that realism is an attempt to depict reality as it is, so realism, we know what that means, but obviously realism in that sense is not that applicable to the fantastic, because science fiction and fantasy are about invented worlds. They're not about depicting reality as it is. So realism in that sense is not applicable, but naturalism is what I'm going to suggest is applicable. And so what Émile Zola meant by naturalism was that he thought that fiction was a way of conducting an experiment. And he had been influenced by all the recent developments in science, such as Darwin and evolution, and the question of whether people's characters are innate or formed by their environment. And so he was interested in telling a story where you imagined a sort of set of initial conditions. You imagined a character born in a certain certain place, with a certain background, with certain parents, and then in a certain social setting. And then he said, what would happen next? What would happen to that character? And so in that sense, what he was trying to do, like he said, as I said, he was trying to imagine fiction as a way of conducting an experiment. And this is, I think, different than how fiction was previously, this is a little different than how fiction was previously imagined. Writers, I don't think, were previously asking themselves the question of, given these initial conditions, what would happen next? But that is what a scientist does. A scientist sets up an experiment, they set up some initial conditions, and then they see what happens next. And so when I use the word naturalism, I'm going to, in the context of the fantastic, I'm talking about this general approach of setting up certain initial conditions and then asking the question, what would actually happen next? And in the case of fantastic fiction, it can be a scenario which is completely outside the realm of reality. Because you could say, like, okay, what if we lived in a world where flying carpets actually worked? And there are a lot of ways you could tell a story about that, but one way is that you could actually start to think carefully about, well, if that were the case, what would actually happen next? So that is what I mean by naturalism. The other artistic movement that I am going to talk about, in contrast to naturalism, is expressionism. Expressionism is a movement, an artistic movement that is most commonly associated with painting and with film. And so, obviously, as an example of painting here, we have Edvard Munch's The Scream. In film, expressionism is probably most associated with the German cinema of like maybe the 1930s. But the primary characteristic of expressionism is that it uses distortion and exaggeration for emotional effect. And it is a way of externalizing the internal. It is a way of taking what is not literally visible and making it visible. And so even though expressionism is not commonly used to refer to prose fiction, I think that it is a useful lens for thinking about several different genres of prose fiction. For example, Gothic fiction. Now, Gothic fiction is often characterized by oppressive architecture and oppressive landscapes. So there are a lot of Gothic narratives where, yes, there is some very creepy house or castle that is out on the moors, and like oftentimes there are a lot of trees with no leaves on them, and often the weather is really bad, and those are ways of using the landscape to not just create a mood, but to suggest that there is something maybe off or something wrong about what is happening in this house. So, as I said, it is a way to externalize or make visible things which are internal or otherwise not visible. So even though Gothic fiction is generally considered a kind of realistic form of fiction. Nothing in strict Gothic fiction, nothing supernatural happens. But if we move into types of fiction where the supernatural does happen, then I think expressionism becomes an even more useful way of understanding what is going on in supernatural fiction. So, as one example, vampires. Vampires, at first glance you might think vampires, okay, it's you are inventing a monster, and so vampires have many characteristics that that seem natural for monsters. Like, okay, they come out at night and they drink your blood, and they're really strong, and they are in a lot of ways they are powerful predators. However, it is also common in vampire fiction to say that there's a rule that vampires need to be invited in, that they cannot enter your house unless you invite them in. So this is kind of odd if you are thinking like, okay, if I'm imagining the scariest predator I can, why would this predator need an invitation? Why is it that this predator cannot cross your doorstep unless you invite them in? And I would say that the answer is because vampire stories are conveying a certain moral. They are saying that if something bad happens to you, it's because you did something to cause it to happen. If you had been good, you would be safe. But you did something, you invited this evil force in, and that is why you pay the price. And this is also true of, I think, we can also see certain other aspects of vampires in this, from this perspective. Because why are vampires often destroyed by sunlight? That also seems weird, because if you're imagining the scariest predator that you could imagine, why would it be killed by daylight? Wouldn't a monster that can survive daylight be scarier? But I think that is, this sort of makes sense if you think that back to this era where sunlight was the best disinfectant, maybe in some ways the only disinfectant. Sunlight destroyed things that were unclean. So yeah, if anything was contaminated, you hung it out in the sun to clean it out. So vampires, they are unclean, so they are destroyed by sunlight. That is a way of sort of externalizing, making tangible and physical this idea that they are unclean. And also, why is it that vampires have no reflection in a mirror? That just seems really weird. But if you, from a sort of a metaphorical perspective, mirrors in folklore, mirrors reveal the truth. They show you they reveal your true self, and vampires don't appear in mirrors because they have no true self. There is something fundamentally lacking in them, and so in the way that we might be fooled that mirrors reveal the truth. Yeah, we might see a vampire, but a mirror reveals that the vampire there's actually something missing there. As another example, ghosts. Traditionally, ghosts are they're often confined to a certain location, like a specific haunted house. And why is that? I think it's because ghosts are an expressionistic way of talking about memory. Because our memories are very strongly tied to place. And when we visit a place, that location evokes memories in us, and ghosts are sort of the ghosts are your memories made visible. They are, even if they aren't substantial, they are made, sort of concrete. Ghosts are there are many stories where ghosts seem to be forced to sort of reenact the moment of their death over and over again. And I think that this is an expressionistic way of talking about traumatic memories, because if you have been traumatized, you have intrusive thoughts. You will relive a traumatic experience over and over again, whether you want to or not. And I think that that is what ghosts are. Ghosts are again, they are traumatic memories made visible, made kind of tangible, even if they aren't actually solid. And again, there are stories about, where ghosts, they have unfinished business, and I think that is a way of representing the fact that, we have unfinished business. There are things that we wish that we had, settled with certain people, but we didn't get a chance to finish them before they died, and so to make that internal feeling of unfinished business external, we have ghosts who cannot rest until they get certain things done. Now, when I talk about expressionism in folklore, I'm not saying that the people who told these stories, who came up with vampire stories or ghost stories, I'm not saying that they were thinking in these terms. This is just how folk tales evolve. But if you are interested in writing fantastic fiction, what I'm suggesting is that you will want to do deliberately what people who came up with folktales were doing sort of spontaneously or subconsciously. You're going to try and basically do the same things in a conscious and intentional fashion. So in this talk, as I said, I'm mostly going to be referring to naturalism and expressionism, but I don't want to suggest that there's like a single spectrum and there's just naturalism at one end and expressionism at the other. I would say that actually, I think of it as more like naturalism is sort of a fixed point, because the question of, like, given a certain premise, what would actually happen next? I think that is something that we can kind of agree on, like on what that means, and we can think about that question in a way that we all understand. But most fantastic fiction, I'd say, is not engaged in naturalism. Most fantastic fiction departs from naturalism, but for many different reasons. So there is surrealism, where things just happen sometimes just because they're really weird, and there may be no explanation, but at some level, just the fact that there is no logic behind it is maybe the point. Then there is also satire, where you are departing from naturalism, but you are trying to make a point, and you are engaging in exaggeration for humorous effect in order to get that point across. There's expressionism, which I have already said is about making the internal external. But there is also romanticism, which is, I would say, what was a very common form of fiction, of storytelling in the past. In stories about noble knights who, say, like in the legends of King Arthur, you had a noble knight who was tempted and then maybe resisted temptation to prove that he was actually worthy. So that's a romantic pattern of story that we are sort of familiar with, and that's a we like that story. That's a good story. And so like if you want to tell that story, you can tell that story. But you're not going to say like, well, that's what would actually happen. That's not that. Asking what would actually happen if there was a noble knight. It's like that's not what stories about knights are. So romanticism again is a departure from naturalism, but for other reasons. And sort of similar to that, is what I am labeling as tropes. And tropes are just there's some things that we are used to in fiction, we think are really cool. We like them. We like fights where the hero and the villain meet at, they have a climactic fight, like usually on the edge of a cliff, like, yes, we like that. People like that. People like heroes and villains having fist fights at the edge of a cliff. And so, yeah, if you want to do that, yes, you should do that. But, we know that in reality, most of the time there are no heroes who have fist fights with villains on the edge of a cliff. That's just not reality. But we're departing from any sort of sense of reality or naturalism because they're just tropes that we like. So I want to talk a little bit about fantasy. And I want to talk about how we can see both naturalism and expressionism at work, even within the category of fiction known as fantasy. I would say that naturalistic fantasy, one example of that might be George R.R. Martin's, his either Game of Thrones, if you know the TV series, or The Song of Ice and Fire, if you know the novels. Because George R.R. Martin was, at some level, he was, basically thinking about the War of the Roses, this period in British history. But he was also thinking about, some things like, okay, let's say you had a world where there were these super long seasons where you might have a winter which lasted decades, and what would that be like? So to some extent, Game of Thrones, some of the world building in Game of Thrones is an attempt to answer the question like, okay, yeah, what if I'm telling the War of the Roses, but I'm telling it in a world where there might come a winter which lasts decades or a century. So at some level, he is trying to work out what would actually happen. So there is a fair amount of naturalism in George R.R. Martin's approach to world building for those novels. And it's there is magic in Game of Thrones, but not all. Magic is not the primary driver of what happens in Game of Thrones. A lot of it is just like politics between kingdoms, and yes, some of the politics is affected by the fact that winter is coming, and that's gonna be a big deal. At the other end of the spectrum, we have something like Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. I would say, it's not really clear what is going on in Kafka's Metamorphosis. People still argue about what Kafka meant by it. But one thing that we know Kafka's Metamorphosis is it is not a naturalistic attempt to. He's not trying to answer the question, well, if a person woke up one morning and found himself turned into a giant bug, what would happen next? That is not at all what would happen. Because probably what would happen is his family would be screaming, nonstop, in Metamorphosis, it's these more odd, there are these odd responses, And so, it is probably has something to do with expressionism about, Gregor Samsa's feelings of alienation maybe taking on, becoming externalized. But so it's probably closer to expressionism, although I'm not going to say definitively what that is. But my point is that there even within works that we regard as fantasy, there is naturalistic fantasy and then there is expressionistic fantasy. And you can actually see naturalism and expressionism even within the same work. And Lord of the Rings is, I think, a good example of this, because Tolkien was a philologist. He was a student of language. And if you read up on sort of his inspiration for writing it, one of his inspirations was, what does language evolution look like if your speakers live 1,000 years? So he spent a lot of time working on Elvish languages and trying to imagine, because he knew how English had evolved, how European languages had evolved over thousands of years, and he was interested in the question of how would languages evolve if your speakers live thousands of years. And so he spent a lot of time working out the linguistics of Elvish languages. This is not something that maybe a lot of people, a lot of readers of Lord of the Rings maybe are aware of or pay a lot of attention to, but this is actually something Tolkien was himself very interested in. So he was, at some level, engaged in naturalism because using his, expertise about languages and language evolution, he was trying to think about what would actually happen if you had language speakers who lived thousands of years. So there is naturalism in Lord of the Rings. However, there's also a lot of expressionism in Lord of the Rings. And I think this is maybe the most clear in his descriptions of the land of Mordor. Because one question I have wondered is, are there any green fields in Mordor? Like, can anyone raise crops in Mordor? What do they do for food? Where do they get their food in Mordor? Because Tolkien describes Mordor as kind of a wasteland, and Tolkien has said that he would, because there's a sea in Mordor where the water is poisonous, and Tolkien has said that he was actually inspired by the Dead Sea in Israel. But the thing is that no matter what your feelings on Israel are, we can agree that Israel's policies have nothing to do with the fact that there is a Dead Sea in Israel. Germany was the birthplace of Nazism. Germany has beautiful landscapes. Germany has lovely forests and beautiful mountains. So in the real world, landscape has nothing to do with the politics of the people. There's no connection whatsoever. But in fantasy, there's a connection all the time. It is the most common thing in the world for the landscape of some fantasy kingdom to be a reflection of the character of the people in that kingdom. That is just something that is so common in fantasy that we kind of take it for granted. But it's important to remember that that is not how things work in our world. There are, the politics of any nation, is utterly independent of how attractive the landscape is in that nation. and this is, like in some ways, like also, reflected in, just there are a lot of other tropes of fantasy about how like, witches are ugly. Witches are ugly because ugly people are evil, and there's again this idea of this expression is of this externalization of the internal, like individuals who are ugly on the inside, their ugliness manifests on the outside. And it's like, yeah, that's a terrible idea to hold in the real world. If you think that in the real world, you got to stop thinking that right away. But in fantasy, yeah, we're kind of used to that, and so that is that's expressionism, and that is the norm in fantasy. Also, I'd say that in terms of like if there's a system of magic in a fantasy story, sometimes there are novels where the magic has a lot of rules, and then there are other novels where the magic really has no rules at all. And roughly speaking, I'd say that if the magic system has a lot of rules, there's probably some it's probably leaning a little bit toward naturalism, because once there are rules, you can sort of work out certain consequences. You can engage in some kind of set up certain conditions and see what follows. When magic has no rules at all, then probably expressionism is more at play, because the way the magic works maybe has more to do with how how characters feel, and how their internal emotions become visible. So now I'm going to switch to talking about science fiction. Now, I would say that science fiction leans very much more toward naturalism than it does to expressionism. I think science fiction is very much about trying to set up initial conditions and then work out what are the logical consequences. However, I don't mean that science fiction has to conform to real science. Science fiction doesn't require that you study a lot of physics or biology or whatever. What I mean is that what I think of as important for science fiction is that once you have figured out what your premise is, then you work out what the consequences are logically. So even if the premises have nothing to do with our world, as long as you are thinking about what would actually happen, then you are engaged in a kind of science fiction. And for me, that also includes asking the question, like, how would people behave in a world where things work a certain way? Because, for instance, if there was a world where flying carpets actually worked, I think there would be some people who'd be like, how does this work exactly? Can I do experiments? What happens if I put one flying carpet on top of another? Does it make a difference if I flip it upside down? Because I think like in every world there is somebody who is going to be asking questions like that. There is somebody who is sort of just wants to puzzle it out, wants to figure it out. That's I think that those types of people are found in every world, and so whatever the rules are of this world, as long as there are people in that world who are trying to figure it out, then like that helps me believe that it's a plausible world. I don't care what the rules of the world are. What I care about is, are there people who are wondering, hey, well, okay, can I make this work? Can I fiddle with this? Can I tinker? So as a sort of shorthand for thinking about world building in science fiction, I'm going to make reference to there's an approach that business people often use, which is called PEST analysis, PEST, which is short for political, economic, social, and technological. And business people are often recommended that, okay, like if you are planning a business, you should be thinking about these different factors and how your business will respond to these different factors. And I think that this is useful, is also useful for science fiction, because this is a way of asking, a variety of the questions that I think will help you engage in good world building. So in terms of politics, you ask the question like, who is in power? Who has power? How did they get power? How do they hold on to power? And who does not have power? In terms of economics, it's like, okay, how do people make money? How does money work? Because no matter what the laws of physics are, there are also certain kind of just principles of economics of how money flows in a society. And so if you think about that, that will make your society, I think, more believable. And then there are social questions like, are there different social classes? Different social status, different levels of social status. Presumably there are different races, presumably there are different genders, presumably there are different ethnicities. And how do those things relate? How do those things relate to everything else, like who has power and who makes money? And then there's the technological, which is tied into what I was saying a minute ago about, are there people who are trying to understand how the laws of their universe work? Because if you have a universe where levitation, works, there are probably going to be people who are like, okay, so can I investigate levitation? Is there anyone like a scientist in this world? Even if they are not, exactly, what we think of as, they aren't doing. They aren't engaged in, the type of physics that we have in our world. They are engaged in studying something about the universe. I think, and as I said, I think there are going to be people like that in any universe. And what are they doing? What are they able to figure out about how their universe works? That also, to me, helps build a realistic world. So I also want to say that because when I talk about this, it might make it sound like science fiction is all like it's just getting into just like very sort of technical questions, and maybe those are not that interesting. But I would say that is not actually the case. And I want to use this novel as an example. So this novel, Aurora, by Kim Stanley Robinson. This is a novel about a generation starship. So it's a gigantic spaceship where people will be living for over 100 years on its long journey to another star system. And so in this novel, there is a lot of discussion about what it takes to keep a starship going for like hundreds of years. Like, how do you grow crops on this? And are there problems when you if you keep growing crops on the same soil and you have no way of sort of replenishing things if you're having to recycle stuff? And so there's a lot of discussion of soil chemistry in this novel. But this is not a novel about soil chemistry. This is a novel about people who they are forced to live their entire lives according to decisions made by their great-grandparents. So their entire lives are constrained by something which they had no say in at all. And so yes, they have to deal with questions about soil chemistry, but the reason they have to deal with these questions about soil chemistry is because they live on this starship and not on Earth. And so they are asking the question, like, is this just? How could our great-grandparents have possibly made? How could they have made these decisions? Is there any way that could be ethical? That a person makes decisions which will strongly constrain the lives of your great-grandchildren. And I think that is interesting, heavy ethical, a very interesting, heavy ethical question. That brings in a lot of, philosophy and ethical reasoning. Because at one point in the novel, the characters actually talk about whether this is the equivalent of a war crime. Is their entire generation the equivalent of a victim of a crime against humanity that their great-grandparents committed? So that is I think that when you look hard enough from a naturalistic perspective at any scenario, you will eventually find rich thematic material. You might think like, okay, like this is going to be about soil chemistry. That doesn't seem interesting. But if you push hard enough, you will find that it is not just about some dry scientific topic. It is about how do people live together in a society, and that is the fundamental question that we all have to consider. That is the maybe the most important question that humans face. And so naturalism as a strategy does not lead you just into like boring scientific stuff. It will also lead you into deep philosophical questions. There's also expressionism in science fiction, but as I said, expressionism in science fiction is much less common. But there is a story that I want to talk about as an example of expressionism in science fiction, and it's a story called "The People of Sand and Slag." And this is set in a world far in the future where human beings have transformed their bodies so extensively with technology that they can eat sand for nutrition. They can eat anything. They can eat raw tires. They can eat metal. They can eat just anything in a junkyard. But yeah, they can eat sand for nutrition. And in this story, some characters, they come across a biological dog which no one has ever seen before, and they're really puzzled by this dog because it seems really fragile. Because like at one point, like they break one of the dog's legs, and the dog's leg doesn't heal. And they're like, wow, that's really weird, because their bodies just heal automatically no matter what injury they sustain. This is not a naturalistic science fiction story, because it does not conform to any kind of scientific realism. there's nothing like, for one thing, there's no way that any organism could eat sand for nutrition just from a simple chemistry basis. That's not possible. But also, like, these beings, like, they look exactly like humans, yet they're made of sand. It's like that that also doesn't make sense. And there are just these other questions like, how is there still a dog alive, a biological dog alive, in this world where like pretty much the entire world has just been turned into things like oil fires and junkyards, and it's this barren landscape. The story is not interested in questions like that. What the story is engaged in is exaggeration for emotional effect. It is trying to make a point about what it would be like if humans are so completely removed from the natural world that we don't even really recognize the natural world when we see it. It's a story about this humans having utterly remade themselves in such a way that they cannot even make sense of nature. They've utterly divorced themselves from nature, and it's and I think it is a pretty effective story. In some ways it's kind of a horror story, but it is depicting a kind of sort of a logical end point to what would happen if we continue on our current path, where it seems like our civilization is constantly sort of pushing itself further and further from nature, and that we are at some point it seems like, yes, we might no longer recognize nature if we see it. So expressionism, this sort of exaggeration for emotional effect, that is a tool that science fiction can use. It's not a super common approach in science fiction, but it does exist. So let's see. I don't know. Maybe I will. Okay, I'm gonna skip over some stuff to. I'm gonna talk about a movie. I'm gonna skip over one movie. I'm gonna talk about two movies, but I'll just talk about one. So I'm gonna skip over. All right. So I'm gonna talk. I want to talk about movies because expressionism is a very common strategy in movies because movies are a visual medium, and movies are all about making things visible. Things, set design, costume design, hair and makeup, all of those are carefully chosen in order to make certain things visible that would not otherwise be visible. This is just the nature of movies, and which is why expressionism, as I said, is usually is most commonly used to describe a certain era in film where like there was a lot of really dramatic shadows. That was the most sort of overt form of expressionism, but pretty much every movie which is not shot in a really documentary style is engaged in some degree of expressionism. It is trying to make things visible which would not normally be visible. So, and I want to talk about expressionism in one particular movie, which is the 2003 movie Hulk by the director Ang Lee. A lot of people, maybe don't remember this movie. This was well before the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it was not a very successful movie. and it was fairly early in the era of superhero films, and I think people were still trying to figure out what audiences wanted from a superhero film, and it would be a while before movie studios really figured it out. But I think Ang Lee's Hulk is actually a pretty interesting movie in terms of its treatment of the character of the Hulk. So you might know that the Hulk is this comic book character. He was a scientist named Bruce Banner. He performed an experiment on himself, and then whenever he gets angry, he turns into a giant green monster. And so that was the version of the Hulk that was in the comic books for decades. And then when Ang Lee made this film in 2003, he actually he and the screenwriter, they changed the origin story for the Hulk. So the movie does not actually start with Bruce Banner. The movie actually starts with his father. And so in the movie, his father is also a scientist. His father performs an experiment on himself. And he alters his DNA. And then he passes on these genetic changes to his son, Bruce Banner, who then, becomes a scientist. An experiment goes wrong, and then Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk. And so one question is, why this change? Why start with the father instead of Bruce Banner? Why add this extra step? And I would say that the reason for this this change is because Ang Lee is trying to metaphorically say something about inappropriate anger. Because if we see the Hulk as sort of a representation of inappropriate anger, what this movie is saying is that when a man responds with inappropriate anger, it is because of something his father did to him. The Hulk, Ang Lee's Hulk is a story about a father and a son and the anger that this legacy of anger that the father has passed down to his son. So Bruce Banner, basically, in this version, Bruce Banner, he gets his inappropriate anger reaction is a direct result, is a literal, physical result of something his father did to him. And so that is, I think, an expressionistic representation of the idea that when men respond with inappropriate anger, it is because of something their father did to them. So at one point there's a conversation between Bruce Banner and his girlfriend, and she says to him that your anger is triggering the nanomeds. That's the thing that he injected into himself. And Bruce Banner says, how could that be? Because we designed the nanomeds to respond to physical damage. And she says, emotional damage can manifest physically. And he says, how? And she says, serious trauma, repressed memories. And so, and this is pretty interesting because we actually know this is true, that, repressed, that emotional trauma can manifest physically. And, that is an actual thing. And so, but in the real world, that it's relatively subtle and not not super dramatic. So but the fact that emotional trauma can manifest physically, that's a little bit of sort of real expressionism in the real world. But for the purposes of a comic book movie, they're going to amp that up. They're taking this little bit of what is actually true about trauma, and they are magnifying it. So in this version of the story, it turns out that Bruce Banner, when he was an infant, he actually witnessed his father murdering his mother, and he has repressed that memory. He does not consciously remember it, but that traumatic memory is contributing to the fact that he turns into the Hulk. That is the emotional trauma. That is the buried pain that is bursting forth when he turns into the Hulk. Oops, sorry. Okay, so then at the later in the movie, Bruce Banner's father appears as this weird kind of energy-absorbing monster, and Bruce Banner and his father have to fight. And because the father has this energy-absorbing power, he actually he feels he has the advantage in this fight against Bruce Banner, the Hulk, because he says, the angrier you get, he's saying to Bruce, the stronger I become. He says, the more you fight, the more of you I take. And then Bruce Banner responds, you think you can live with it? Take it. Take it all. And then, but the rage that the Hulk is manifesting, this rage energy actually becomes too much for his father to withstand. His father, as an energy-absorbing monster, absorbs the Hulk's rage, but it exceeds his abilities to contain, and then he actually kind of dissolves. He is just ripped apart by the force of this rage. And I know, like, it's not you can't tell at all what is happening in these images because it's a very weird sort of abstract kind of fight. It's yeah, so it's a little odd, but metaphorically, what is happening here is this is a literalization of the interactions that people have when they are fighting, because anger feeds what they're saying is that anger feeds on anger. Anger only increases. It engenders more anger, and it is only by letting go of your anger that you can escape this cycle, that you can eventually free yourself. And so, what Bruce Banner is ultimately able to do is to let go of his anger, and then his father, who can only feed on this anger, is eventually destroyed. So, and this is why I think that this movie is a pretty interesting movie. Like I said, it was not a commercial success, and yes, and I'm not going to say it's a great movie because there are a lot of things about it which are kind of weird, including just this really weird climactic battle, which is kind of vague. So yeah, I'm not going to say it's a great movie, but I think it's a really interesting movie. And I think it is ambitious in a way that subsequent superhero movies generally have not been. I think it is certainly ambitious in a way that more recent treatments of the Hulk have not been, because because the character of the Hulk, is, I think, an interesting character, because the Hulk is expressionism personified. He is the internal made external. He is anger given physical form, and that is interesting. That I think that idea has a lot of potential, and Ang Lee was interested in exploring that potential in a way that I think subsequent treatments of the Hulk were not. So I'm going to wrap up, and I want to just say a little bit about mixing naturalism and expressionism. Mixing a sort of this approach of starting with a set of initial conditions and then working out the consequences of what would actually happen, as opposed to this approach of externalizing the internal, or exaggeration or distortion for emotional effect. You can use both in the same work, and as I pointed out earlier, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings does use both at different points. I think, but the most important thing is setting reader expectations appropriately, because if you engage in naturalism for a while, if you start like explaining the logical details or extrapolating very rigorously, you might create certain expectations in your reader, and they will start to read the work in a certain way. And then if you switch it up into an expressionistic mode, then your readers will probably be disappointed or puzzled or just baffled. So the most important thing is to figure out what is the most important thing, and then what is the thing that you want your reader to really take away from this, and then sort of work toward that. Work toward setting the appropriate expectations in your reader, and then working to fulfill those expectations. And so, like, if you're interested in ghosts as a way of talking about memory, that is great. That is fine. However, it might be difficult to do that in the same story where you are sort of imagining, like, well, what are the political implications of ghosts, or what are the economic implications of ghosts? So either of those are perfectly reasonable things to do, but maybe not in the same story. So again, you got to think about, like, what it is that you're interested in. And so if you are interested in the metaphorical significance of ghosts as representations of trauma, then it probably isn't the right thing to do to worry about the economic implications of a society that has ghosts in it. Finally, I'm going to finish off with this quote from the writer Kelly Link, where she said, "A vampire is a flexible metaphor. Death, sex, change, stagnation, loss of self, loss of agency, having to keep one's real self secret, the possibility of something lasting forever, love, hate, grief." So, if you're writing speculative or fantastic fiction, I think the most important question to ask yourself is, what do you want your speculative element to say about the human condition? So, in any type of fiction that you write, you're going to be thinking about your protagonist's motivations. What does your character want? And in any piece of fiction, you will be asking, really, this is actually two questions. What does your character think they want, and what does your character actually want? Meaning, what is the sort of subconscious thing that is motivating the character? Because, like, it's, as a very obvious example, like, your character thinks they want to be a successful doctor, but what they actually want is to, make their parents happy, or something like that. Characters don't always know what is actually motivating them, just in the same way that people in the real world don't always know what is actually motivating them. So in any piece of fiction, you're going to be sort of thinking about these two different questions about your character's motivation. If you are writing speculative fiction, this distinction between their conscious motivation and their unconscious motivation is, I'd say, even more important, because in fantastic fiction, your character's unconscious motivations will probably have something to do with the fantastic elements in your story. The fantastic or speculative elements in your story are probably, you will probably want to pick them to fit with your character's unconscious desires. So that way, the story that you wind up telling will resonate with what your character actually wants. So you need to ask yourself, what am I trying to say if I am using some speculative element with, vampires or zombies or whatever? What am I trying to say when I use these things? And once you have some sense of that, then you will be able to deploy that trope in a way that reinforces your character's journey. What your character learns, it will help your character become a vehicle for the message that you were trying to convey. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your insights, Mr. Chiang. As a writer of short stories, how do you think the genre, or should I say the medium, has changed in the last few years, especially with the Netflix series about short stories becoming more popular? And are they still a viable path for writers wannabes such as myself? Do you think as a generation, we should still try to work towards short stories being our main media of writing?
Well, okay, so I suppose this is we need to distinguish between sort of artistic goals versus economic viability. So in general, obviously, being a writer is not a great way to make a living. I hope that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. And writing short stories is also not a great way to make a living. It is almost impossible to make a living writing short stories. But I would say but yeah, that's the economic viability question. In terms of aesthetic goals, I think short stories as a mode remains a healthy subgenre of a healthy mode of fiction. I think yes, there are still there are still good writers doing good work in short fiction, and any individual, the question of whether they should pursue short fiction, I'd say, has more to do with their own particular affinity, because short stories and novels are very different, and you can be good at one and be terrible at the other, and some people are good at both, but being good at one is not a good predictor of whether you'll be good at the other one. And so, so I would say that, like, in general, short stories, they are a good testing ground because you can iterate fairly quickly. You can complete a short story. You can fairly quickly. You can try a bunch of different things with short stories fairly quickly. And I think that's a good thing to try, simply because of because you can iterate quickly, and then you can fairly quickly discover if maybe you don't like short stories, or like you try to write short stories and they just keep getting longer and longer, and if that happens, then you will learn, like, okay, maybe longer work is where your affinity lies. So I think I think starting with short stories just makes sense from a practical perspective in trying to figure out what your preferences are as a writer. And if it turns out that you like sticking with short stories, I would say, yes, you should stick with short stories, because making money as any kind of writer is hard enough. It's very unlikely. So you should write what you are moved to write, and if it's short stories, yes, then write short stories. Because writing what you are genuinely moved to write is what will enable you to do your best work, and that is what I think what one's goal should be, irrespective of economic considerations.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask, what made you gravitate towards writing science fiction? What do you find special about it that makes it a medium to explore ideas, compared to other genres? Like, why science fiction and not, well, anything else?
So I've always been drawn to science fiction. So I started trying to write science fiction when I was 11 years old, and at the time, the types of stories that I was trying to write then were pretty much adventure stories set in outer space, which I think is probably not uncommon for 11-year-olds. But over time, my tastes changed. The things I looked for in what I read changed, and as a result, the things that I was trying to do in fiction also changed. But I was always able to find what I was looking for within the genre of science fiction. So, as an adult, what I became most interested in One of the things I was interested in as an adult writer was exploring philosophical questions. And I think science fiction is really well suited to dramatizing philosophical questions. So I guess when philosophers pose thought experiments, their thought experiments can often seem very abstract and theoretical, and it can be hard, I think, for a lot of people to understand, like, well, why should I care? But with science fiction, you can create a world where this thought experiment is an actual real-world situation. And then you can have characters for whom this question is of vital importance to them. And if you are able to make your readers empathize with these characters, then I think your readers will gain a more visceral understanding of why a certain philosophical question is worth thinking about. And so that is something that I specifically find interesting. And so for me, science fiction is a way to do that.
In trying to write science fiction in a naturalistic way, so trying to answer the question, what would happen if, would you suggest to complete the world building process beforehand, so before actually starting to write, or to try to answer the question as you start to write the story?
So, I guess if naturalism is your goal, then it probably makes sense to do a fair amount of world building before you start writing. Because otherwise you might find yourself, your story going in a direction which, really might not make sense if you do the world building later. You might run into inconsistencies. But I guess, I don't know that it's necessary to start out with naturalism as your sort of I don't know that one needs to sort of commit to naturalism up front. And also this really depends on the type of writer you are, because like if you have some sense of what the story that you're trying to tell is, and you have some sense of like where you want to go, then that's probably the most important thing. And I would say maybe only do as much world building as is necessary to support the story that you are trying to tell. And then a deep commitment to naturalism is probably not helpful. On the other hand, like if, for instance, maybe you don't know what the story you're trying to tell is, but if you are interested in world building, if you are thinking like, okay, like here is a world which, like, yes, I'm interested in a world, and there's some speculative element, and you're thinking like, okay, what would a world look like with this speculative element? And then if you don't have a story in mind, and you just want to see, like, okay, are there interesting stories to be told in this world? That is, that is a perfectly, viable approach. Also, if you are just sort of, like, you have some speculative notion and you want to do some world building, you're trying to flesh out the world, there's a very common piece of advice given, which is that for how to turn a world, like, if you have a world in mind, how do you generate a story for that world? And the commonly suggested strategy is, so as you are thinking about this world that you have invented, think about who is unhappy in this world. Because no matter what world you imagine, there are people who are unhappy. Even in the best society imaginable, there are people who are unhappy. And so, like, if you have invented a world where there's some fantastic or speculative element which runs through that world, you can probably find a character who is unhappy and whose unhappiness has some, direct relationship to this speculative or fantastic element. And then, that is a potential protagonist. And following that character, figuring out what does that character want, how will that character try and get what they want, will they succeed at that? That can generate an engaging story, which at the same time illuminates what is interesting about this world that you've built.
Thank you.
Ok, l'ultima. Poi lasciamo andare.
Hi, thank you for your class. I couldn't stop thinking all the time about a novel that is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I always thought that putting it in the Gothic novel box felt kind of limiting. And after your class, I see so many elements of both naturalism and expressionism in it. And I wanted to know your opinion on that. Where would you collocate it?
So, so Frankenstein is there are a lot of scholars who think of Frankenstein as the first science fiction novel, and I guess, and I understand the arguments for that, but I guess I personally think that Frankenstein fits in the Gothic tradition fairly well. Frankenstein as a novel, there are elements of science in it, but it is not, I think, I guess to my mind, it is not deeply engaged with science. It is not deeply engaged with world building. It is not deeply engaged with futurity. It's not trying to imagine what the world will look like. And for me, those are things which characterize science fiction. So yeah, I guess I think of Frankenstein as being more, in some ways, more like a Gothic novel, and it's kind of it's kind of a story, it's a creator and created being story, but in some ways it's also sort of a father-son story. Yes, and so yeah, I guess yeah, I guess I tend to think of it as more of an example of Gothic fiction that kind of yeah, it moves from the Gothic into sort of the supernatural, and it has some science in it, but to me, science is not its primary concern, and its relationship, because it is often cited as a sort of a parable about science, but I guess I feel like that works better on a metaphorical level, because I think I don't think it is engaged a lot with science as a process or the scientific worldview. I think it is more Gothic horror.
Ok, grazie Mr. Chiang. Grazie mille. Grazie a tutti voi.